maybe remind you of the topic, where you may have noted that there are three keywords: growth, agnosticism, human rights, and social inequality. So I'll first talk a little bit about growth agnosticism, and maybe a concept that is less familiar to some of you, to then move on into the implications for human rights law. So where does it come from? Well, in fact, I have a PhD student who defended this afternoon, and he did his PhD on the question of how to make sure that energy production, electricity and so on, is in conformity with sustainable development. And so that's in a way how he brought to my attention very important and interesting literature on planetary boundaries, and the implications possibly for human rights law, because that's the field I work primarily in. And here you just see one of the many images you can find, but one produced by a very important center, the Stockholm Resilience Center, a picture that shows how, in a way, for some aspects, we are still in the green area, where you could say we are in the safe zone. But for other aspects, biosphere integrity, biogeochemical flows, we are really already beyond the zone of uncertainty. And so there we have triggered effects in the environment that we no longer control and can no longer predict what will happen. And then you see the orange as zones of uncertainty, but where we know that we are also stretching planetary limits. And so the question is, what does that mean? So next slide, please. What we also see is that all these very important developments on the environmental side, which really also more and more generate dramatic changes in climate, but also in other respects, that these are felt in a very unequal way and also caused in a very unequal way. And so here you can see this map, for example, produced by Global Ecological Footprint, which shows more or less what the contribution is to some of the effects, some of the consequences of transgressing these planetary boundaries. And so typically, if you see red, it means that the footprint of consumption exceeds biocapacity. So we are kind of consuming more than the biocapacity allows. If you are in green, then it means that the biocapacity still allows for more, for higher, heavier footprint of consumption, you could say. And so we see that certain parts of the world are clearly coloring very red to dark red, and others are very dark green. And so you see that the contribution to these quite massive and dramatic developments are caused in a very unequal way. Next slide, please. Yet another interesting map, the carbon map, and if you go online, you can really play with it, and you see, depending on the issues that you explore, how the map in a way transforms and shows where a certain impact is, for example, much higher and so on. So this is mainly about the unequal burdens as the consequence of climate change in particular. Remember that these planetary boundaries are much more than about climate change. Climate change is only one of the elements, but it's of course an important one. And so here you see very unequal burdens. Next slide, please. So some have tried to show how when we discuss climate change, and you could say by extension, these changing environmental patterns which lead to all kind of long-term dramatic consequences, that these can be captured by looking at least 4 categories of inequality. So if you try to analyze these phenomena, One element you may want to take into account is the asymmetry in contribution to climate change. Also to look then into remedies and responsibility and so on, that may be an important question. Another one that determines the inequality of contribution but also of impact is the vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, where we know that some of the lowlands of countries, some islands will disappear when we have rising sea levels, so their vulnerability is a key element. Yet another element one may want to take into account is the capacity to mitigate, and then of course also the power to decide on solutions. Just to show that if we talk about inequalities, that there are quite some dimensions to it, and I will need that in a minute in my presentation. Next slide, please. So that brings me to my first concept, the concept of growth agnosticism. There is quite a debate in the field of law and development, and certainly on sustainable development and law, what we mean with the notion of sustainable development. And so one definition, and you could say the more mainstream one, is that we say, well, sustainable development is basically about the 3 P's of sustainable development: people, planet, and profit, and it's all about balancing the 3. So it's about balancing economic growth with environmental considerations, the planetary boundaries, and social considerations, which are very often then framed in terms of human rights considerations. But there is also a minority view, you could say, a more radical view, that argues that if we are serious about sustainable development, that we should use a strong definition of sustainable development, which means that if we have to choose, planet comes first. So that there is a prevalence of the environmental principle of planet over the economic and the social one. So if you have to make a decision, do we protect the environment here? Do we go for economic growth, which may also have positive social effects? The argument goes you should prioritize the protection of the planet, the environmental principle. And that has led to quite some literature in economics, and it's sometimes brought together under that umbrella term of ecological economics, where it's argued that what we need to learn, certainly in my part of the world, in Europe, is to manage without growth. And there you get then diversity of views. Some say, well, we have to learn to live with zero growth, no further growth. Others are more radical and say we will really need, at least in a period of transition, a period of degrowth in what we call the global north then. Yet others have said, well, we are not too sure, but in any event, our whole social model, the way we manage society, the way we do politics, should be growth agnosticist. So we should work under the assumption that we don't know whether there will be economic growth or not, sometimes also referred to as a growth, and that should be the starting point in the way we organize society, the way we distribute and redistribute goods and services, and so on. So here you may see my problem. If you tell me, and let's take that as a starting point, that we may have to start from a position of growth agnosticism, what does that mean in terms of social impact? What we typically are trained to know and believe is that without economic growth, there can also not be any social progress. And so in terms of realization of socioeconomic human rights, for sure, the prospects would be rather grim. Now, that's not the argument developed by the ecological economics. So they, in a way, project as an alternative model what they call prosperous, or some of the authors call prosperous degrowth. So their argument is, it's not because you have to go for a growth or degrowth, so that you can't take economic growth anymore as the foundation in your society for further social progress, that you take away the perspective of social progress. And they argue what you need to do is to replace, in a way, the driver of social progress. And you replace economic growth with redistribution. And so that's the key argument. And so in a catchphrase, they say then the economies of the future should be distributive by design. And here comes in, of course, the next slide, please. The question for me then, what that may mean for human rights and for a human rights lawyer like myself, who is interested in questions of development of socioeconomic rights. One of the models that is quite popularized, but I would say that is really intriguing. So if you read this book, Donut Economics, written by Kate Raworth, it's really very stimulating thought, and it's academic work, but that has been popularized. So it's not just a cheap presentation. But so here, for example, in this model that is developed, the argument is that we need to find a place that is, on the one hand, safe for humanity, so meaning we respect these planetary boundaries, we accept there is an environmental ceiling, and if we try to push through that ceiling, then we get all these issues that I started off with, but where we also create a just space for society, so where it is not only an environmental ceiling but also that social foundation. And if you look at the inner circle and the words you see there, that social foundation goes very much back to a number of human rights, socioeconomic human rights we know. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the second part. What does all this mean for human rights? And the question of social inequality that we also seek to address through human rights, most directly through economic, social, and cultural rights, but also through equality, and one could even add civil and political rights, I would argue. Well, what I've been trying to look into, and where my research is now looking into, is the question then, how could we contribute from a legal perspective, from the perspective of human rights law, to this notion of prosperous degrowth or a-growth. So where can you mobilize human rights law to contribute to that economy that is distributive by design? And my argument, in a way, is that there's at least two pathways, and I present them here separately, but of course they interact also. One is that you could say, well, we look again at the way we have codified and interpreted and applied economic, social, and cultural rights, and maybe we need to revitalize these rights. Maybe we need to strengthen them to make them more distributive. And one way of doing that could be by looking at what Desierto and Gillespie have called the normative lattice, and I will develop in a minute a little bit what they refer to. Another strand of thinking that one can see is that there is a renewed interest in equality, the concept of equality, where the argument has been made that we need to revitalize the equality norm, because we have, in a way, used it mainly to address all kind of differential treatments based on race, on gender, and so on. But material socioeconomic inequality has been, to some extent, neglected in the way we conceptualize equality. And of course, since what I showed you, these environmental challenges, also these social challenges are not limited to the boundaries of a particular state. So in addition to the domestic dimension, we also need to add, I argue, a global dimension, which would then need to develop further legal vehicles, like the notion of global human rights obligations, for example, or extraterritorial obligations, or a notion like the right to development. And in particular, what you see there in the right bottom of the slide is very much law in the making. There is not yet very strong hard law existing there. All that is law in the making, and so it shows how the legal and the political are clearly intertwined also here. Next slide, please. So one pathway, and I will only flag a couple of issues here. I'm happy to develop them further later on if needed. But so one pathway could be that we, in a way, reinvigorate ESC rights, and in particular, what characterizes ESC rights, what the commonality is of economic, social, and cultural rights. And one is that they depend very much, legally speaking, on progressive realization. And that's what we have written into the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and in other UN treaties at least, that in a way the obligations of states to realize economic, social, and cultural rights depends on the maximum available resources, and typically the assumption is how do you increase resources, and so how do you make progressive realization of ESC rights possible through economic growth. So what happens if we take away that assumption of economic growth as a starting point, but replace it with growth agnosticism? What does that mean for that whole idea of progressive realization? Some have argued that there's certainly other options, and so that one does not need to focus exclusively on economic growth. But most likely what you would expect is that the moment you have degrowth, that you also then are forced to take as a state retrogressive measures, so even reduce the level of realization of ESC rights. Typically, the argument is that there is a strong presumption that retrogressive measures are not allowed except in exceptional times, and so the question is whether the growth agnosticism and certainly degrowth would not push us into that direction. We've seen certainly when we had degrowth because of the financial and economic crisis more than 10 years ago, for example, that retrogressive measures were taken. So that is a concept that may be revisited if we want to make sure that degrowth or growth does also not lead to a massive increase in retrogressive measures. And so the question is whether we can make that concept more robust to resist more strongly these developments. We also use typically for ESC rights minimum core obligations, which in the reading of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights are either non-derogable, so meaning that even in times of emergency, no derogation is possible. So you have to at least ensure these minimum core obligations, or in another interpretation of that committee, there are at least priority obligations. The question again is, will they survive in a way a situation of growth agnosticism, let alone of degrowth, or will be these minimum core obligations then also further watered down? And then there is this idea of the equality norm that pervades each of the economic, social, and cultural rights. So the right to education means also equality in the field of education in terms of access and so on and so on. There the argument has been made that equality, also socio-economic inequality, is really a problem from a human rights point of view. Philip Elson has even argued extreme socioeconomic inequality, extreme poverty is the antithesis of human rights. But the question is whether we will not reinforce inequality if there is no longer economic growth as the driving force for social progress. And at least what Elston and others have argued, and I tend to agree, human rights law is pretty silent and also pretty weak conceptually to really engage with these questions of radical socioeconomic inequality and so to bring about distributive equality. Next slide, please. So maybe just an idea to give perspectives on what that could mean and to revitalize the equality norm, to strengthen the equality norm in particular. And this is also my second pathway I introduced, remember. So that could mean that we need to better think through how we address horizontal inequality. So question of socioeconomic inequality, and not only what has been called vertical equality, I meant inequality, and not only status or horizontal equality, which is considered to refer more to particularly socially constructed groups like race, gender, religious, and so on, the typical grounds, prohibited grounds of discrimination. So one challenge could be to bring in this idea of redistribution, distribution and redistribution much more in the concept of equality. Others have argued, like Samuel Moyn, that what we really need is not just protection floors, so minima, but really also a ceiling on inequality. And that's quite a radical proposal, but it ties in with this argument that if you want to bring about social progress through distribution, then it's not just about lifting up the poor, but it may also mean that you have really to put a ceiling on how much inequality is acceptable in a particular society. You may have heard that my dog was just drinking water coming back from his walk, so please ignore that background noise. Next slide, please. So I won't go into this much further because I'm also running out of time, I realize, but so further challenges would be the question then whether human rights law, and in particular also the equality principle, is up to that task. Can we really legally reconceptualize equality so that it manages to address the structural injustices we have, the power relations that play in the background? Can it really give us guidance also in how to develop pre-distributive policies and also redistributive policies? So there are many questions there that are currently quite heavily debated in equality law, particular also in a country like South Africa, with the disappointment of what it has not brought about, the whole kind of notion of equality and affirmative action. And so we can build on that, I think, to revisit our concept of equality and to see what the potential is of equality in guiding us through this process of an economy that becomes distributive by design. Next slide, please. And then there is that international dimension that I mentioned. As you may have noted, I showed you in a way world maps. The challenges we face, ecological challenges, social challenges we face are of course to some extent domestic challenges, but you cannot see them and disconnect them from the international context. And remember what we said, one of the dimensions, categories of inequality is the contribution to, for example, climate change, which is very uneven, and where the global north in the past has made a tremendous contribution through industrialization to these effects. Nowadays, the picture is I think less unequivocal, but these questions are at the heart, I think, also of what we need to look into. How do we also organize redistribution internationally, and what is the role of human rights law there? And I just flagged two concepts that are out there and debated in literature. Extraterritorial or global obligations, where you accept in a way that human rights obligations do not stop at your borders, but go beyond your borders. And then, of course, the long-standing debate on the right to development, in particular in its external dimension, which implies as a minimum a duty to cooperate, for example, to address climate change and all its effects. So I'll stop here. Just by showing that I'm neither the radical who argues that there is no role for law to play, but also not the one who naively thinks that law will fix everything. So here you see two opponents also in a heated debate, Moyn and Elston, precisely on where the limits then of the law are in bringing all this about, or contributing through law to prosperous aid growth. And this is really my final word now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vandenhole. Thank you for your speech. It was quite interesting, and at the end, this punchline of Bob caught our attention. So Thank you very much. It was very interesting. As I said at the beginning, it was very interesting because actually more here in our region, in Peru, because we have these two sides as an independent topic most of the time, the last years, one by his side, but they have a very strong connection, right? Because we cannot talk about human rights development on one side, independent of the economic growth that we are experiencing now. Now we have like a little pause by the situation we all know, but maybe we can start growing again. So thank you very much. And now I will give the pass to Professor Arelí Valencia, who will have her comments since from the development and human rights approach to. A continuación voy a darle el paso a la profesora Arelí Valencia, que nos va a dar sus comentarios y desde una perspectiva en la que ella investiga, que es también los derechos humanos, el derecho al desarrollo y en enfoque de género y de justicia ambiental. Muchas gracias. Adelante, profesora. Mucho gusto.
Muchas gracias. Well, good morning to everyone. First, I want to thank the organizers of this event, the Master in Human Rights and the Master in International Economic Law of the Catholic University of Peru, for the invitation to comment Professor Wouter Vandenhole paper, which I really enjoy reading it. This is a very engaging paper due to its interdisciplinary and critical perspective. It is provocative as it pushes us beyond the dominant way to study and understand human rights. And it is particularly interesting for those of us who truly believe in the transformatory potential of human rights discourse, but feel frustrated on the limited impact the discourse has had so far to address injustices such as economic inequality from a structural perspective. So the way I would like to add into this conversation is to unfold the main argument of Professor Vandenhole paper in a way that allows me to build bridges with additional body of literature that will further support his main arguments. I'm going to stick on my notes because English is my second language and I tend to go into branches as well. So the main inquiry of these papers, as I read it, is to question whether it is possible to fulfill human rights, particularly socioeconomic rights, within the context of an A-growth economy, which in brief, as I understood, it means a creative economy that moves away from GDP fetishism as the principal indicator of well-being and societal progress. The exploration of this question made the author to claim the following. First, the human rights law regime has not again engaged sufficiently with questions of how to address inequalities beyond the status-based formal equality paradigm. Second, in order to fulfill this gap, we, human rights academics, practitioners, activists, and so on, need to do a better work in engaging with other disciplines. He does so with ecological economy in this paper. Using the inputs of this interdisciplinary exploration, he suggests to reconceptualize the idea of equality so that it includes a substantive notion of it. And in doing so, we will be better positioned, as he argues, to design prescriptions and operational guidelines for decision makers to engage with the human rights approach into redistributive policies and planning. So far, so good. It is really hard to disagree with these proposals. We are all in. But then he concludes with a warning statement that I quote because I love it. It is to be remembered that law is often not proper, and that human rights law, in particular, in its market-friendly version, often fails to address power relations and socioeconomic redistribution. More is needed than the law to eradicate extreme socioeconomic inequality. With this conclusion, the message is clear-cut, at least for me. And it goes in two ways. One, if we want to build a robust notion of substantive equality, we need to engage in the terrain of social scientists and economists that have done a significant work so far, producing evidence about the root causes and consequences of inequality. And two, linked to the first, we need to accept that the human rights approach is not the domain of the legal discipline alone. Thus, the notion of human rights violation and the notion of inequality, if we want to make the case that it is a human rights violation, needs to go beyond the perpetrator-victim remedy legal model to denounce violation. As I mentioned at the beginning, I would like to bring some recommendations of additional literature to follow Professor Vandenhole's final message. So working on the first message, what I got, which is to engage with social science or interdisciplinary literature. I would suggest to engage with development studies. Additional to the literature of degrowth, which is brought into this paper, I recommend engaging with development studies, particularly with those who have a critical standpoint of the idea of development and the way it has been imposed in the global south, which is related to our context, with direct implications into the production and persistence of inequality over time. If we look at how development studies and discourses and their prescriptions have evolved over the years since it's emerged in the decade of 1950s, we will see that there is sufficient evidence that demonstrate that economic growth doesn't automatically eradicate poverty and socioeconomic inequalities. This is the way that new development discourses sprang up during the 1970s and 1980s, promoting the idea of redistribution with growth and basic needs approach, which strive for a balance between growth and equity concerns, which is basically what Professor Vandenhole wanted to think about in this paper. And since the decade of 1990s, influenced by the contribution of economist Amartya Sen, the human development discourse entered into the international development lexicon, reaffirming the view that economic growth can only represent a means for a higher end with well-being and freedoms, defining as people's ability to lead the life they value. In this line of studies, Rannis and Francis Stewart add compelling evidence by demonstrating that countries with economic programs oriented towards fast economic growth do not necessarily perform well in terms of human development. So in order for a country to enter into the virtuous circle of development, as the author refers it, economic growth must be promoted in parallel to redistributive policies and democratic practices for human development achievements. So in this manner, the human development approach consolidates its importance within the international development arena by making normative that national goals of economic growth should not entail sacrifices in people's overall well-being and quality of life. And this is one side, because what Professor Paper makes us think about is, what if we do not take as a true the idea of economic growth? What if we accept or engage with those proposals that question only growth, and we need to go beyond, incorporated different indicators, incorporated other kind of discussions beyond GDP. So in the context of Latin America, the human development discourse closely interacts with that of inclusive development. And I wanted to cite it because in one part of the paper, Professor mentioned inclusive growth. So to be specific, the inclusive development strategy was prompted and has gained greater prominence since 1990s as a result of the failure of the neoliberal market-oriented economy to reduce inequalities in the region. And this strategy was endorsed by the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, CEPAL en español. They brought back into discussion the old dilemma of whether we need to secure economic growth ex ante for redistribution ex post, or whether a balance between both is not only desirable, but possible. So a pathway towards inclusive development should prefer the second. And this goes in line with the premises of Professor Vandenhole's paper. So yet in practice, what we have witnesses in the region, and Peru in particular, is a strike back of the economic growth discourse to support the new extractivism. This is large-scale mining and oil investments. So the tendency in the region has been to uphold a rentier state attitude that favors the dominance of the extractive industry as a strategic sector for economic growth rather than promoting economic diversification. So the argument have gone into argue that the importance of the industry to promote the necessary growth and wealth to be redistributed to fund social policies that translated into poverty and inequality reduction. And the question is, has that happened really? And we have to be critical on that. So at the background of this literature from development studies is the message that economic prescriptions and decisions are not only technical, but there are issues of power and domination behind them. So the question that we need to ask is who benefited from development and who gets the negative consequences of it? So to sum up, if human rights advocates or academics or lawyers want to engage with the question of socioeconomic inequality, they need to engage with development discourses and issues of power and domination. And then we go back to the question of Professor Vandenhole's paper. Do we have the tools to do that? Do we need to design new tools to do that? And here is the point that brings me to the second message I got from this paper, is the engagement of inequality and human rights beyond the legal domain. So similar to Professor Vandenhole's paper, one of the most recent issues of the Humanity and International Journal of Human Rights, it's the volume 10 published last year, 2019, focuses on the interaction of human rights and inequality. It encompasses a wide variety of papers, which oscillates among those who are very skeptical of the ability of human rights to tackle inequality. And I'm going to cite that Samuel Moyn as well, who thinks that the human rights is part of the problem of what we are still dealing with, the persistence of inequality. So the human rights language really doesn't help. And he just put it away of the panoramic of view of possible solutions. And then we have those who think that there are some space for development tools. And here I want to focus particularly in the paper of Professor Rodrigo Primi in that journal. He is from Colombia and has a very interesting work on critical views of human rights, but he's critical optimistic, not critical pessimistic. So I find that the paper of Rodrigo Primi resonates with the message Professor Vandenhole brings in his paper. He argues that human rights can have a transformative potential to tackle the persistence of socioeconomic inequalities. But in order to do so, we need to go beyond the naming and shaming and the legal activism, which has been the traditional tools that the movement of human rights has used to expose and denounce human rights violations. As good as they are, they're just not sufficient. We're not neglecting their importance. We're just saying that they are not sufficient. So they are part of the perpetrator-victim remedy model, and as such, they only focuses on the consequences of human rights violation, leaving untouched the root causes of what caused that violations, which are located in the unjust structures of society, the colonial legacy of them, the development model of our economies, and the structures of power that underlie all of what I mentioned. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done, particularly in the context of post-pandemic as well, which clearly will reinforce inequalities and expand poverty, which within countries and globally. So what to do then? Because there is a big question and a big task that this paper leaves us to all of us that believe in the language of human rights. And what I suggest is to continue exploring the work of academics or activists that have been trying to engage with methods in the social science to present or explore what are the causes of a problem, and with that deep understanding of the causes of the problem, how to really address solutions. Some authors that I would recommend is Colleen Shepard. Colleen Shepard has a book, and I have it right here. She is a constitutional scholar from Canada. And in her book, Inclusive Equality, the relational dimension of systemic discrimination in Canada. She develops like a model to understand and evaluate the persistence of inequality over time. So basically the message is to don't understand inequalities as something that happened in one specific moment, and that's what happened when we just see the consequences of an act of discrimination, but to really understand how it's related to the structures that cause that inequality. So she suggests to look at a model that she has designed and calls the contextual method of address inequalities, and has the micro side, then the meso and the macro level. And in each level, she kind of unfold the different layers in which inequalities are structured. So she presented an understanding, and that's why she calls inclusive equality, that shows how inequalities are relational and systemic. The production is relational and systemic. And if we understand that, we will see clearly that the solutions at the legal level just tackle one side of the problem, and we need to start working in more. And part of the work in all these different layers is to create more awareness in policymakers, in citizens, in everybody that uses the language. I work in the public sector right now, and I work in a sector that works in the Ministry of Justice of Peru, and it's a sector that developed the National Plan for Human Rights, and there are lawyers working on it. But still, what we find when we do participatory spaces to talk about future planning of policies to protect most vulnerable population, what I feel particularly is that when you sit in the table with economists or social scientists that are also public policymakers, they are kind of skeptical in the language of human rights, because it has been the domain of ethical and normative prescriptions. And I think that we need to find tools that allow us to build bridges and to connect with them, connect the language and make it stronger in the way that they convince them that we can actually produce ways to address problems such as inequality and poverty from the human rights perspective. Otherwise, there will be a group of Samuel Moyd's followers that will not believe that human rights can go beyond courts. And that's basically the message that I want to also share with you, and that I got from this paper, and basically to say this is another paper that opened a door for further exploration, for continue exploring the different possibilities of engagement of human rights from a multidisciplinary perspective, and that particularly lawyers who work on the human rights approach need to work engaging with different literature, particularly with economists, and if we want to really make a contribution to tackling inequalities. In the context of the pandemic, we will see the reinforcement of inequalities, the expansion of poverty. So we have to start thinking about how we're going to use this, not only to denounce the status for non-action in provision of services, but what needs to be changed in public policy, so we are prepared to deal with what is going to come, but also what are the lessons that this pandemic has taught to all of us. There were rapid responses of governments in providing economic bonus to people that were losing jobs, and quick measures like that, economic measures like that. So what I got is their budget, their funds. We have to think about how do we use it, and the pandemic shows that if this situation wouldn't have unfolded, maybe that money will have gone to different spaces just supporting the status quo. But we had to get into this dramatic and drastic situation to rethink our economy and start supporting those who need it. So there's ways to do it. We just need to engage with those who do public policy makers, those who take the decisions, and being critical also to issues of power and domination, which I mentioned already. So, well, thank you very much. And again, I really enjoy reading this paper.
Thank you very much, Professor Arelí. Muchas gracias, profesora, por sus comentarios y su experiencia también. Y ahora le doy el pase al profesor Víctor Saco, que tiene sus comentarios desde una perspectiva, digamos, más lado económico, crecimiento e inversiones.
Thank you very much, Diego, also for taking you take the organization of the conference and all the administrative issues of it. Yes, I think the topics that were interesting for me from the international economic law point of view is this idea of the planet boundaries, of the limits of the planet towards the growth of the nations, of the growth of the states, and also the possibility to have some regression measures. And I was thinking from this point of view of international economic law, if the treaties that we have, the free trade agreement, treaties of the free or the international investment agreements are some kind of limitation for taking these measures of the growth. And I just wanted to explore and to contribute to the debate if the states decide to take these measures of the growth or take another approach, that they will find a barrier in the free trade agreements or the international investment agreements. So I will also stick to my notes to also keep the time and have some also extra time to discuss and have the Q&A. First, the point of view is free trade agreements have been created in the, well, if we take the point of start in the GATT, maybe the 40s of the last century, the idea was in the comparative advantage idea, or was to generate growth or to produce more. So usually at that moment, the idea was that one state could produce more to export more and to generate benefits. But the idea it was the growing, the most exportations was the better for the country. Well, times have changed, but the idea remains. The difference is the actor who produced the growth. Nowadays, we are not talking about the states, but we are talking about enterprises, multinational enterprises that take advantage of these comparative advantages, or taking advantage of the laws of the countries, also the technology to produce in a delocalized way to have cheaper products. So, but the idea on the basis is still to grow in, to produce more, and this generates impacts in the environment. One of the boundaries that Professor Vandenhole has just spoke to us minutes before. So these treaties that have been created to open markets, to generate growth or growing production of products, some of them who are necessary, because I'm not against the trade of all the products in general. There are some products that is necessary to provide and also necessary to trade. Now we're speaking about vaccines against COVID-19. We were speaking about medical supplies for treating COVID-19, from beds to other supplies for the hospitals. So there are goods that are important also from the agricultural point of view. In some cases, in other cases, it could be also unnecessary and well, sometimes protectionism is disguised into health security, but that was not the point. In many of the cases, we also have a mass production of products that maybe are not too necessary for the use of the people, or to remain in the circle that Professor Vandenhole has shown us in the paper and also in the presentation. So the idea to open the markets of these treaties needs to also to be balanced, but some measures that were included in the treaties are also some rights that the states wanted to remain in their sovereignty, or to keep in the case of exceptions. I'm talking about, yes, I just said it, I'm talking about exceptions. So these treaties also have exceptions and need to fulfill with them. So in the case of not maybe regression, but maybe on the change of measures in the state, also to maybe degrowth productions, something that has happened with the closest of boundaries, for instance, for Peru in some markets. But if we remain in the case of Peru, well, the frontiers were closed for persons, but not necessary for products, because we still got importations from different products, and the measures from to the tax administration and also for the tariffs administration were open. So the boundaries for products remain open. We have some protocols, phytosanitary protocols to them, but the consumption were open. And also, well, if we take it from the point of view of generating impacts into the environment, some of the transportation generate many impact in the environment, not only for the consumption of oil, but also for polluting some seas, maybe sometimes of the structure of the time of using of some boats, or if you want, some ships. So this idea to reduce commerce could have an impact in the environment, and also will have an impact in production that could also affect, for instance, some capitalist system and also some system of production. But the idea, but that I leave that study for the economists. The idea here, if it's a state that has already treaties, could implement some of these measures that could generate the growth if we follow the ideas to have a better life and a better redistribution or a better equality among the persons of the states. Well, all the solution will need to pass by the interpretation of these exception clauses. And the only way to fulfill with the requirements of these exception clauses will be to make a study if the measure is most of the time necessary. So we will need to make a balance of what the goals of the measure is to protect the environment, to achieve equality among the populations. We need to see if the measure is necessary to fulfill these requirements. And after that, we need to also see if this what I call a sincere measure. So it's not, the state is not cheating the other states parties just to apply the measure. And that's really easy to fulfill if the measure is not discriminatory and is really not a measure related to protectionism. Usually when you want to generate true growth in capacities and in rights, remember Amartya Sen, as Professor Valencia said, usually if a measure is conducted to this final goal, needed to be non-discriminatory and also is not a protectionist measure. But also, and now taking into account international investment agreements, maybe there we have some limitations in the way that we proceed to implement the measures. Because international investment agreements have already, in ratifying international investment agreements, states have committed to some measures to some procedure to implement measures. So at the moment that the state implement a measure, taking into account the international investment agreements, criterion as proportionality, as necessity, transparency, and other, also non-discriminatory application, will need to comply in order not to generate an international arbitration that could be more contraproducent that the measure are to apply. So just to be short and maybe giving space to discuss, I'm not taking into account all the problems that Professor Vandenhole just exposed in the paper. I think Professor Valencia did it in a better way than myself. But from the international economic law point of view, it's important to take into account these treaties and the rights and obligations considering these treaties if we want to apply this new mechanism. Saying so, also, I'm also agree that the solution not only passed by the international economic law or international human rights law. Sometimes it's also a problem of politics and also decisions of the persons, and sometimes it's a customs of the persons to a way to have life at the moment and a way to produce and a way to consume. And I think even if this sounds very hard, COVID-19 has helped some of us, maybe the ones who have more privileges, because a vast population in Peru, the poor population, the poor communities have been really struck very hard by COVID-19. But from part of the population who has privileges and are also connected with the centers of productions, and also as many of the consumers of these products from other parts of the world, they have seen or maybe realized or have the opportunity that the needs to survive in times of quarantine are less than they used to need to survive in other times. So consumption can be reduced, and the change of productions can be moved to other paths. Services, for instance, in education, our two masters organizing this program, we have taken into advantage of giving the service just via internet and saving time to our students not to be stuck in the traffic, or have the opportunity, sadly not for a cost, to have Professor Vandenhole with us. So it's important. So taking also into account the policies and also the customs of the persons, I think the change are possible, but well, it will depend on many factors, as Professor Valencia and Professor Vandenhole have said before. But in the case of a decision of that kind, I think international investment treaties or international free trade agreements will not be an impediment to make the changes. The changes need to have a procedure that will need to be transparent, non-discriminatory, and also necessary, following the correct steps, and it's possible to apply. So the final line is, as always, law is just an instrument. The important thing is to use it for a goal that benefits the society. And with that, I leave the floor to Diego.
Thank you very much, Professor Saco, for your comments, for your new perspective. Muchas gracias, profesor Saco, por sus comentarios, por su acercamiento al tema desde un punto de vista macroeconómico, internacional. A continuación, le comento a nuestros asistentes que tenemos un espacio para sus preguntas, dudas, comentarios. Pueden levantar la mano si desean, y pueden preguntar en inglés o en castellano. Estamos con gusto recibiendo preguntas y traduciéndolas si es necesario, o si no, pueden escribirlas por el chat. De hecho, tenemos ya una, está dirigido a cualquiera de nuestros tres ponentes. Nos la hicieron en el formulario de registro que distribuimos para poder ingresar. Lo voy a leer primero en inglés y luego en español. Mr. Vandenhole, this question was already asked before in our registry form. Somebody asks, it's unknown, the person who asked this, but he or she asks, what development model will states apply in a post-pandemic world?
Yes, thank you. Also to the two commentators for the very insightful comments, and which in a way opened very new lines of investigations and further research that where I'm very tempted to say we should start joint research instead of expecting me to develop it further. So we'll certainly come back to that. I think I see my role also as an academic as transferring some ideas to a broader audience, to students, to policymakers, and so on. And so some of the ideas I shared with you certainly belong to that category. And then you hope, as also Professor Saco pointed out, that in exceptional times like now, that here and there these ideas are maybe picked up and people realize. But I think I also have to certainly like post-pandemic, I hope that the people and governments will not say back to business as usual, and that we will learn both in terms of consumption patterns, but also the kind of what we realized here in this part of the world at the beginning of the pandemic, how dependent we were for basic medical equipment and so on countries far away, and where when transport comes to a halt, you all of a sudden have shortage in certain products and so on. So I think we've learned the limits and felt the limits of the current economic system. And so I hope we will here and there learn from it, although it doesn't look well in Belgium, at least. So we see that people, in a way, are longing for returning to the usual situation before the pandemic, and so also the shifts in mobility and so on we have seen with less car traffic and so on. All these are very quickly undone as soon as you lift the most restrictive measures. So in that sense, I'm hoping for some fundamental changes, but I'm not very hopeful that they will actually occur, which is, I think, also a message for us to much better understand the psychology in society and see how you can affect more sustainable change in attitudes. I also, I think, should have emphasized, and so I would like to seize the opportunity now that, of course, the perspective I have brought, and ecological economics itself acknowledges it, is very much a global north perspective. So when they insist on degrowth, they're talking about a global north, and they're talking about kind of the historical responsibility for so much planetary stress. And so they say we need radical change, at least in the period of transition. And so those who, in a way, caused to a large extent that planetary stress that forced the planet in a way to exceed its boundaries, those have to take in a way responsibility, and so that's where they primarily locate the need for degrowth, also to allow other countries to grow, because they are not naive, and so it's not just distribution. You need an economic basis before you can talk about distribution. So in that sense, that's an important qualifier, and I think Professor Valencia has also brought in that warning and that perspective by referring also to development studies and perspective. Having said this, I'm hoping that there is not that path dependency where first countries have to go through the same stupid mistakes that the global north made of industrialization, unlimited economic growth, and so on, before you then start thinking about, but what is the planetary impact and so on. So I hope here and there these ideas about degrowth may raise awareness and may allow people to creatively think about shortcuts so that we don't get a mimicking of all the mistakes that were made in the north and that led us to the current situation as well. So that's the way I see it, and I hope that also, although indirectly, response provides some response to the question about the post-pandemic situation, where I hope we will learn from it, but where I'm not very hopeful it will actually happen. And the same goes, I think, for climate change. If you see what the scientific evidence is, if you see what's happening in now on the west coast of the USA and so on, we can't ignore it, and people feel it directly, and we see it on our television screens, and still it seems very difficult to take action and seriously engage in exploring alternatives.
Sure. So the question is, what development models should be implemented or fall in the post-pandemic context? That's a very difficult question to answer, because we already, pre-pandemic, we already have had various difficulties with development models. So there is no one unique formula that would apply to the entire world. And in saying that, I guess trying to connect with the paper again is, I'm going to just mention one part of the paper when Professor Vandenhole was talking about this proposal of revitalizing the equality norm. I found it really interesting that the concept that he uses to situate us. When we talk about equality, redistribution, what are we talking about? And he brought, citing other authors, two concepts: predistributive policies, which are linked to labor institutions, like also unemployment insurance, wages, minimal wages, laws about care and protection, parental leave, financial regulations, and then the redistribution policies are more focused in the fiscal policies and the monetary transfers and social protection. So we need to, this is kind of the skeleton of how the social and economic system of society works. So when you assess how good or why some countries are more successful in others in reducing inequalities, you need to look at that, how they have been structured their economy and the social system. And that structure precedes the pandemic for COVID-19, and that structure will have to be assessed in terms of how that reality of each country with better social system, with better health systems, translated in better ways to address inequalities in the post-pandemic context. And I say that also to link to the question that is in the chat posed by Fred Bennett. Hi, Fred. It's glad to have you here. Which is very interesting. And I would ask, what are the for you to respond this right now, but you're mentioning different kind of indicators of inequality in different countries and how they had a positive impact or negative impact in specific countries, and to compare and contrast the situation. It is difficult to just have an opinion just reading the question, because I would like to know in each case and each country, specifically what I mentioned that Professor Vandenhole mentioned in the paper, how these countries structure their predistributed and redistributed policies in order to see and assess critically if that has had an impact in more successful responses or less successful responses. One thing that I want to bring into this reflection is that I discussed in one of my past classes. There is an article that has been published in the International Journal of Human Rights, SUR. The author is Juan Pablo Bojolavsky. It's an Argentinian scholar, and the article is called COVID-19, the Economy and Human Rights. And he states the following: inequality is not a virus, but a political choice. And the suggestion of this, well, he goes into the discussion and identification how the international institutions that are related to taking decisions about the global economy are already making moves in order to make prescriptions of what's going to be the economy after pandemia. The Monetary Fund, the International Monetary Fund is already thinking about prescriptions, and what he wants to warn us in this article is that, watch out, we have to be careful to just accept prescriptions as in the past. Austerity cannot be an excuse to accept reductions in the protection of human rights. We cannot go back to the policies, the neoliberal policies, or the prescriptions similar to the neoliberal policies in 1990s, because we already know what were the consequences of this. Particularly in Peru, the consequences of neoliberal were various, but I want to mention a couple. The immediate reductions of budget to for specific sectors like education and health that are related to the protection of socioeconomic rights. And this is why today in this country, in Peru, we have a very crappy, excuse my word, but very crappy healthcare systems that didn't allow us to respond to this pandemic in a way that we ensure that everybody has the right to receive, to fulfill the right to health, access to healthcare services. And this is just one example. So I think we have to be we need to start engaging into this kind of conversation, engaging with those who will decide what is going to happen to the economy. Right now, it's kind of decision within national boundaries, but because of the context. But it's going to be at some point that we will start receiving the prescription of the international economic domain. And with the past experience, we will need to counteract any kind of prescription that will entail reductions in the protection of human rights. And this is kind of the main reflections or insights that I get from papers like the Professor Wouter Vandenhole was not wrote in times of the pandemic, but the message is clear. If we want to engage with issues of inequality, it doesn't matter in the context. And actually, this context, it's a context where taste the ability and possibility to think about an economy that is not growing, but is it possible to protect human rights in this economy? Why not? And we have to explore, and we have to make inquiries on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Arelí. Now we have the comments on the same topic by Professor Victor Saco. Professor Saco, adelante.
Thank you, Diego. Also, this answer is maybe too limited to Peru and maybe from an empirical point of view. But I think the pandemic has shown the country, well, thinking in Peru, the same that has shown us when we needed to stay at home. And I'm talking from a privileged point of view. When you stay at home, you start to realize, because sometime before the time I just passed too much time outside home, that there were some things lacking in my home, that some things that I need to prepare. And I think that this pandemic has shown us also that, and things that are important. I think that the Peruvians, what need to have a feeling is that they need to, as just Professor Valencia just said, we need a better health system. Also, many of Peruvians have also discovered that they need a better education system, and not maybe only because of the education, because the education system has something also that was high. It was the possibility to give the parents time to work and to produce. And so at the time that realized that there was this hiding cost in education, that was also a need. Also, it has revealed something that we already have, and we were trying to fight against it. And maybe also this political problem with the president now has also revealed, is that the Peruvians are quite upset against corruption. So, and also fighting with corruption, get a better education, get better health system, all related to, and maybe I'm talking to in the terms of Asimoglu, to have better institutions. So to get strong institutions in Peru will maybe some of the needs of the post-COVID era, and maybe we'll try to do that. But as Professor Vandenhole said, that happened with the traffic in Belgium, that also happened with the traffic here in Peru, and also but the customs of people is sometimes what we just want to do when everything this ends is have what we had before and don't think about what we have learned. And I hope that doesn't happen in the case of Peru. Thank you, Diego.
Thank you, Professor Saco. Now we have 3 new questions. The first that arrived was maybe a kind of ironic situation. Maybe it comes from Fred Bennett, that says, it told us in recent years there has been a growth of inequality within many countries of the global north, but at the same time a reduction of inequality between certain countries fueled by the economic growth of China and some sort of India. In the past, other poor countries have used export to grow their quality of life, like the Southeast Asia. What our speakers see as the relationship between these 2 different levels of which inequality can be measured, and being kind of sense of is there only one way to measure inequality? I mean, considering the many different realities. Thank you, Mr. Vandenhole. You have the microphone.
Yes, let me just try to be brief and share some initial ideas. I think what is being pointed out and what I've tried to clarify already in my previous answer is that I'm not arguing that economic growth is always problematic, and so that we should avoid economic growth. So the message that we get from ecological economics is very much for the global north, and so it would mean that exactly countries like China, India, and so many others get also a space to grow without globally exceeding these planetary boundaries even further. That's the whole take I have on the issue. So I'm not ideologically against economic growth, and nor most of the ecological economists, but it's more taking these planetary boundaries seriously, and so accepting that there are limits to growth if you see it at a global level, and so it will mean that you need to think also about global redistribution, with leaving space for more growth in certain parts of the world, and much less, and maybe even degrowth in other parts of the world. I think what the chat, the comment in the chat also clearly shows is that we need to add additional layers of sophistication in our analysis. Certainly the analysis that you often would see in terms of global inequality would be about the north versus the south. That's very often still the way we organize a discussion in the UN, and how it takes place, and then you get the discussions about development cooperation and so on. What the comment points out is that more and more what we see is that inequality within countries is problematic, and very often even more problematic than inequality between countries, and so it's certainly true that is at stake in the global north, and increasingly so, that we see there a growth of inequality, and so not a choice, a political choice, not a choice in society to redirect itself towards more distribution, but so it's moving away from some of the distributive measures and creating more inequality, and I'm the least well placed to point out, but the little I know is that certainly Latin America is quite good at extreme inequality within the countries. So you have extremely rich and extremely poor people. So you know what this is about within countries, and so I think we need to bring that into our analysis, that inequality within countries, which in a way in our thinking is easier to address, because the thinking about solidarity and who in a way should contribute to lessen inequality is a discussion also in philosophy that is very often still kind of limited to the boundaries of a nation state and so on. So I think in that sense we may be slightly better equipped to at least address inequality within countries. But I think the second part of what is in the chat is then also a question whether we can speak about a human right to equality that stretches across state boundaries, and so I wouldn't call it, I think, a human right to equality that applies that way, and certainly not an invocable or an enforceable right as such. But I think that the underlying idea, of course, of global obligations, extraterritorial obligations, is exactly that human rights obligations do not stop at your borders at all times. And so in cases of demonstrable causation, it may be easy to, in a way, identify, okay, this country X caused that violation of a certain socioeconomic right, or caused that increased inequality. But very often it's about the structural setup of our global economy that also creates and enforces inequalities. And so there I think we need also a language to address that. but not in a way that we simply mimic, I think, the way we understand human rights obligations and enforceability and so on in the domestic sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vandenhole. I don't know if Professor.
I just wanted to excuse myself because I have to run into a different meeting. I'm in my time of work. I'm working right now in the office. I just wanted to say thank you for these wonderful conversations and discussions, and also for the participants with these great questions, and to the organizers for inviting me. And have a good afternoon, have a good night, good evening, Professor Vandenhole back in Europe, and happy weekend to everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you very much, Professor Arelí, for your participation and your speech. Thank you for your knowledge. And I'm sure we can count on you on next webinars. For sure. This question has a previous context to Professor Vandenhole. It says, kindly, Gracie asks us, in Peru we are close to our bicentenary, yet we are still struggling with problems as gender inequality, inclusive poverty, poor development. Now we are facing an economic recession in the middle of a pandemic. So, what you consider are the main problems? I mean, these are just the results of previous problems. Yeah. What do you consider are the main problems that inhibit our representatives to make the impact necessary to attack these problems? And if both of you have like one country or a state in mind that could be taken as a reference of effective sustainable development. Thank you.
Yes, well, this feels like a very overwhelming question where I'm asked to solve the problems of the world. So I won't claim that expertise, but maybe on the final element also of the question. I think it's very important to learn from others, but we have to be very careful with easy transplants. And so we know that also from literature on many different points. We know that in terms of economic measures, we know that in terms of development models, and we know that in terms of legal transplants, it's a huge disaster if you simply, for example, transplant the ideal law to a very different context. And so I think that speaks to many elements, but one is, I think, that you need to, in a way, you will not bring about real change if that is artificially introduced. So it takes developments, it takes very often political action, it may take struggle, if I can use that word, to bring about change. And so in that sense, it will have to be to some extent homegrown and follow its own path. And yes, of course, we can try and learn from other countries, and possibly, but in a very clever way, I would say, follow some of these examples, but without assuming too quickly that they can be transplanted. And personally, I feel more and more that one of the leading regions in the world is exactly also large parts of the Americas. Not to say that all is well there, but if I see, for example, in terms of environmental measures, measures that are taken to increase mobility in capitals. If I think of what I've read about Medellin in Colombia and so on, and how some of these measures also help to reconnect in a way socially segregated communities by, for example, providing public transport and so on. I'm very much impressed, and I think there is a lot to be learned there, because here in the old north, I would say, we probably lack the creativity that I see in other countries. So in that sense, I would simply warn to think that there are leading examples too readily available. I think it always takes that domestic, local, very often also dynamic, and so that will also determine how you go about it. But certainly my invitation would be not to look too far beyond the own continent also for inspiration, for example.
Thank you, Mr. Vandenhole. I don't know if Professor Saco has a comment on it.
Yeah, taking the idea of Professor Vandenhole on that, and maybe also it serves to answer to the question of Fred Bennett and also Enrique Cabrera. I think there is a relation between the growth and also development. It can be used by the state to generate development. But in the case of, as we were talking about exit convention, and it was my point of view at the beginning of this webinar of conference, treaties are tools. At the end, there is the sovereignty right of the state to decide where to take the tool and how to generate development in the country. I think it's important, as Professor Vandenhole says, that the country needs to know the necessities and how the way to generate development. Of course, we have some models to follow, and we can learn from the models just to generate the same kind of development, or just have some shortcuts to achieve it. We don't necessarily need to pass by the massive production and pollution to then gain education to produce services that are cleaner and generate more revenue. With the tools and sometimes with the imagination and creativity, we can just take the knowledge that is in the internet, start to produce services, and be more productive in our countries to generate more growth and maybe more clean energy. I'm not saying that the internet doesn't pollute and to have the servers functioning that also generate pollution, and okay, there is always an impact, but I think there are lower impact than other impacts. So in the case, as Enrique Cabrera was thinking, yes, there is a relation. I think when the exit convention was taken into account, also because ICSID is part of the World Bank group, the idea of the World Bank is to generate projects in development. So the idea is what to generate development. But I think that doesn't give away the rights of the state to think about the development. And I was also thinking is with the growth or the model of growth, we need to satisfy some necessities. And I think the Peruvian government needs to strengthen its institutions. Well, it's a personal point of view. Strengthen the institutions of what we have thinking that is good for us, like health, education, and even the relation with other people. Most of us, I think what we think is necessary is to get in contact with the people that we love or the other people. It's very important for our humanity. But to do it so safely, we have to increase our budget in health, in preventive health and primary health. So just to be short, yeah, there is a connection between the treaties and to achieve development, but the decision in how to develop, I think, stays in the political discussion inside the country. Thank you, Diego.
Thank you, Professor Saco. And we have another question, which is that it says following. Recent publications of the Inter-American Development Bank refer to the economic impact of COVID-19 on children, which is a very vulnerable group, and the need to invest in programs to protect this population. However, the economic measures, the economic crisis, have forced the states to cut the budgets of these programs. So this person wants to know your opinion on how to make a balance between economic measures and children's rights.
Well, I think it takes us back to the issues we've been discussing. My personal view would be that this again shows that there are fundamental political choices also to be made, and if the choice, the political choice, is made, then I think we should not too easily, if the choice is made that these programs for children are, for example, important, then we should not too easily believe that these are no longer possible because of an economic recession, for example. So the alternative reasoning could be, how can we better redistribute, and what does it mean in terms of the way we work with the financial means we have, the way we maybe collect taxes, and there is a really interesting burgeoning literature that it looks more and more into taxation, and how that impacts, of course, on the funds available to the state. So it goes back to these fundamental questions, whether there is a basic option made for not full equality, because that's certainly not what we are discussing, but avoiding these extreme inequalities that in a way certainly affect also basic needs of vulnerable populations like children. And so it means, but I'm not well placed to make that argument, I think, as a human rights lawyer, but that's, I think, one of the strengths of the work, for example, of Kate Rayworth and others, but at least I'm able to read her book, which is on economics, but where she, I think, for me, in a convincing way, revisits a number of the traditional economic dogmas, and where, in a way, her book, Donut Economics, is a rewritten basic textbook of economics, and where she argues many of what we now see as rules, economic rules almost, or paradigms or models, initially started off as hypotheses, and those who developed it were not so seeing them or taking them in that doctrinal way we see them now. And so her book is really an invitation to revisit them. And I think what we know from the development literature is that the trickle-down argument does not hold. It's not because you have economic development that you have then that trickle-down effect, that there is social progress. It may happen, but you will have to make choices, societal choices, political choices, to make it happen. Otherwise, it does not come automatically. And I would say the reverse is also true, that it's not because you have a period of economic a-growth or maybe even degrowth that automatically means that you have to cut all kind of welfare schemes and so on. There are other options possible, but you have to take these options, and that's a matter, I think, of political decision making, and of course also broader societal trends that push politics into that direction.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, profesor Vandenhole. Profesor Saco, le doy el pase si tuviera un comentario al respecto.
No, but I think there's just to close, there are two comments to while Wouter was speaking. I don't know if you can read them, Wouter. It's from Fred Bennett, and if you want to react.
Yeah, well, I was reading Fred Bennett's comment, and I think it would take us very far in the discussion, and maybe I'm there then too much of a lawyer, so I would not accept that rights are by definition trumps on other considerations. I think for many human rights in legal terms that does not hold true, and we very often balance rights with other considerations, be it public security, think of terrorist attacks and so on, with the rights of others, where you can say, well, at least it's another consideration that is also framed as a right. But so I don't think from a legal perspective, at least, that we can argue that in a way rights trump other considerations. Most rights in legal terms are relative rights, and so it's more about the balancing than anything else. So in that sense, I would argue that the way I see human rights is not as absolute trumps. Maybe some of the human rights, like the prohibition of torture, may belong to that category, but most of human rights I see much more in that sense also as bendable, and it means that you will need to use them and mobilize them in a purposeful way to achieve also any contribution, for example, to more equality. But I think it takes us in a discussion that we may not want to take right now. But it's I think part of the very rich discussion and also the interdisciplinary exchange we are now experiencing, and that we should deepen, of course.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vandenhole.
I just wanted to thank Wouter for his time. I know Diego will do it, but it was very special for us that in this cooperation with the University of Antwerp, we wanted to have him as a professor this semester with us, but well, the pandemic came, but we had the opportunity to have him. We have also Professor Conde Veiter last year. So our cooperation with the University of Antwerp, we are taking it very serious, and we're having a lot of profit from that also for our students. And saying so, just to mention that our two masters, the Master in International Human Rights Law and also the Master in International Economic Law, are open for next year. So the persons who want to immatriculate on it and to follow and have the possibility to have a professor as Professor Valencia, Professor Vandenhole, and learn from them, have the opportunity starting December this year for start the procedure into acceptance. Así que sí, si es que están interesados e interesadas en seguir alguno de estos programas y ven los temas que tocamos, pues están más que bienvenidos y bienvenidas de postular a las maestrías y poder aprender desde ese punto de vista. Muchas gracias, Wouter. Gracias, Diego. Te dejo a ti.
Muchas gracias, profesor Saco. Bueno, primero en español, luego en inglés. Muchas gracias al profesor Wouter Vandenhole por su presencia, por estar aquí con nosotros. Como él mencionó en un inicio, vivimos una situación muy complicada, pero dentro de las ventajas que tenemos es poder contar con el profesor Vandenhole sin que tenga que atravesar todo el océano para poder tenerlo con nosotros, ¿verdad? Muchas gracias, profesor Saco. También agradecer, aunque ya no esté con nosotros, la profesora Arelí Valencia por su participación. Y gracias a cada uno de ustedes, damas y caballeros, por estar aquí con nosotros en esta ponencia. Y estoy seguro que no va a ser la última y que contaremos con el profesor Wouter Vandenhole, así como el profesor Víctor Saco y la profesora Arelí Valencia en próximos temas, porque estos tópicos son muy amplios y dan mucho para conversar. Thank you very much, everyone, for your assistance. Thank you for your interest in these topics. Thank you very much, Mr. Wouter Vandenhole, for your speech, for your presence here. In the middle of pandemic, we have to see the positive aspects, and one of them is have great foreigners, teachers like you with us. Thank you on the Human Rights Master Program for your help, your support. Thank you very much, Professor Saco, for your comments. Thank you, everyone. As he said before, both the Master in International Economic Law and the Master in Human Rights are open for new students on his new season 2021. Thank you very much. I'm sure this won't be the last time Mr. Vandenhole is with us, because as he said at the end, this topic is very, very open to discussions. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Have a good night in Belgium. Muchas gracias, muy buenas noches, buen día para todos, buenas noches para el profesor Vandenhole, que ya está en Europa.
Gracias. Thank you, Wouter. Goodbye.
Gracias, muchas gracias, muy amable.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Have a good day.